Peace, peace. Baragani, Islam, Salam, Hetepu, Atep, Rahubat, Gino Lako Ninani, Chief Noble Bandele, back again for another video. And today's video, we'll be discussing the history of the police and its impact and ties to slavery. Okay? So before we get into that, please like the video, subscribe, check out some of our older videos that we've done, and please check out my books, Bandele Yobachi El Amin, several of my books. You can find all these books on Amazon. So with that being said, let's get into this. So we're talking about the history of the police, right? And with the history of the police, we understand that, or we think we understand. We think that police started from the beginning of American history. Since the beginning, they, like they were over here when the Pilgrims came over here or something. But that's not true. Okay, so what we're gonna do is we're gonna look at the history of actual police. So I got Time magazine as an article on the history of the police. And, it starts off talking about JFK making a dedication week to National Police Week, May 15th, in which he noted that the law enforcement officers have been protecting Americans since the nation's birth. But it says, in fact, U.S. police force is relatively modern invention, sparked by changing notions of public order, driven in turn by economics and politics. Okay, according to Gary Potter. So if we go here and say, like policing in colonial America has been informal. And it says based on a for-profit, privately funded system that employed people part-time. Okay, towns are have commonly relied on night watch, in which volunteers sign up for a certain day and time, mostly to look out for fellow colonists engaging in prostitution or gambling. So it was relatively for, basic stuff. Very small, didn't have a lot of power. Pretty much like most things started in America. But it says that Boston started one in 1636, New York 1658, and Philadelphia created one in 1700. Now it says, but that system wasn't very efficient because the watchmen often slept and drank while on duty, and there were people who were put on watch duty as form of punishment. So, like being the policing, it never been like a favorable thing. More like it was necessary at the time, but it looked like it was small. Basically, night watch, privately owned, all that. They said night watch officers were supervised by constables, but that wasn't exactly a highly sought after job either. Early policemen didn't want to wear badges because these guys had a bad reputation to begin with, and they didn't want to be identified as people that other people didn't like. Okay, so that's important. But I wanted to give this backdrop on the history of them, because things haven't really changed a lot. Things haven't changed a lot. But now it says in here, it says right here though, it says as nations grew, however, different regions made use of different policing systems. Now listen, in cities, increasing urbanization rendered the night watch system completely useless as communities got too big. The first publicly funded organized police force. Now this is the real police force come into play. It says that the first publicly funded organized police force with officers on full duty was created in Boston in 1838. Boston was a large shipping commercial center, and business had been hiring people to protect their property and safeguard the transport of goods from the port of Boston to other places. Okay, so right here is also saying how you can see the police force being used to protect commercial property more as well. But I want you to understand that the first police force really starts in 1838. When we looked at the other one as the Watchmen, those were small local people getting together, and they were really not considered police. So that's important because what you'll see is that the police system that comes by 1838 has a model that's even, I say, it's older than the 1800s. It's got a system that it's going to look toward to use in order to start the police force instead of using the watchman philosophy. Okay, and what we're going to see is right here, we're going to look at slave patrol. Okay, this was slave patrol, blog on the beat, slave patrol, an early form of American policing. Okay, now you can read that up there. I'm not going to get into that right there, but you can read that how they had to swear that they were going to, take and make sure they protect people from slavery. So right here it says, when one thinks about policing in early America, there are few images that may come to mind. A county sheriff enforcing a debt between neighbors, a constable serving an arrest warrant on horseback, or a lone night watchman carrying a lantern through his sleepy town. These organized practices were adapted to colonies from England and formed the foundation of American law enforcement. And this is what we talked about previously. Now, this is, however, there is another significant origin of American policing that we cannot forget, and that is slave patrol. The American South relied almost exclusively on slave labor, and white Southerners lived in near constant fear of slave rebellion, disrupting this economic status quo. As a result, these patrols were one of the earliest and most prolific forms of early policing in the South. The responsibility of patrols was straightforward: to control the movement and behavior of enslaved populations. Okay, according to historian Gary Potter, slave patrols served three main functions. So let's look at that: to chase down, apprehend, and return to their owner. Runaway slaves, basically, to provide a form of organized terror, to deter slave revolts, and to maintain a form of discipline for slave workers who were subject to summary justice outside the law. Now, I ain't gonna lie. All this sounds like modern day police. I'm just gonna say, okay? Organized policing was one of the many types of social controls imposed on enslaved African Americans in the South. Physical and psychological violence took place in many forms, including the overseer's brutal whip, intentional breakup of families, deprivation of food and other necessities, and private employment of slave catchers to track down runaways. Now, this whole tactic of terrorism, psychological violence, it seems to still play out, especially among dark-skinned people. Now it does. I mean, the use of force is a primary use of policing today. Uh, let's see. It says slave patrols were no less violent to uh, control African Americans. They beat and terrorized as well. Sounds familiar. Their distinction was that they were legally compelled to do so by local authorities. In this sense, it is considered a civic duty, one that in some areas could result in a fine if avoided. In others, patrollers receive financial compensation for their work. Typically, slave patrols routines included enforcing curfews, okay, checking travelers for their permission pass, basically license today, catching those assembling without permission, and preventing any form of organized resistance. Sounds familiar. It sounds very familiar to today. Uh, let's go down a little bit. The process of how one became a patroller differed throughout the colonies. Okay, so let's look at the time frame. It says the first formed in 1704. South Carolina patrols lasted over 150 years, only technically ending with the abolition of slavery during the Civil War. Just because the patrols lost their lawful status did not mean that their influence died out in 1865. Haddon argues that the distinct parallels between the legal slave patrols before the war and extra-legal terrorization tactics used by uh, vigilante groups during Reconstruction, mostly notoriously the KKK, Ku Klux Klan. Okay, uh, so you can see here, it says 1704. So even though the slave patrols are not as old as your Watchmen in Boston, but 1704 is considerably older than actual police force that came in like the 1830s, the 40s. Okay, so this really does seem to play a major part in how to police when it becomes a major issue with bigger populations in the north. So you can see how dark skinned people were treated by the slave patrol, and if you're in the north, even though it was you know against the law for slavery, there was still a definite racism in the north. So when you look at the police, you they had contact with the slave patrol because a lot of slaves tried to go north, and slave patrol people would come up and try to bring them back. So they had contact with the North, and the North was familiar with the slave patrol. You can even see that. Check this out before we get off. To show you, if you look, this is the Runaway Slave Patrol, Plantation Police, and Chicago Police. So you can see the similarities right here in between there. So this is just a quick look at policing in America, the history. So check it out. Please subscribe and like the video again, and check me out on the next video. Until then, peace.